Hello everybody, it's Mark Anthony Taylor again. Today I want to discuss something I call the QE Doomsday device, which I think is primed and ready for detonation. And we all know that quantitative easing is the policy where the government takes hold of all these bad banking debts, which includes mortgage-backed securities, and also government bonds which have low interest. We all know that there's a zero interest rate policy, which means these bonds which are in the banks aren't giving significant yield, and the banks are in a state of run for obvious reasons. So these bonds aren't giving the banks the yield they need to pay the ATM, to fill the ATM machines each month. So for this reason, we have the buyback of government bonds as well as these MBSs. Now, for the Bank of England, they both print money because they're the central bank, and they also handle what are effectively bank accounts for the big banks, QE bank accounts. For the case of the Federal Reserve also handles it handles the electronic accounts for these banks, but it doesn't actually do the printing. The US Treasury does the printing. The Federal Reserve is a private institution, whereas the US Treasury is more of a national object. Now these bank accounts that these big banks have with the Federal Reserve, they actually pay a little bit of interest. It's equal to the interest rate, which is about 1/4% or half a percent or something, because ZIRP isn't exactly zero. And the currently government bonds are paying next to nothing, 1/10% or even 1/100%. So for that reason, a lot of the banks are just not bothering turning the account positions into currency or bonds. Obviously, bonds just aren't paying anything. Now, this ZIRP is inflationary because any student of economics knows that when you have a high interest rate rather, that's meant to suppress the inflation. When you have a low interest rate, that increases inflation. When you have zero interest rates, the minimum interest rates, and of course that maximizes the inflation generation. So this ZIRP's got to end. I mean, no one's getting any interest on bank accounts, so there's almost absolutely no need to use a bank account apart from making remote transactions. And every kind of bond, corporate bond and whatever, competes with government bonds. So government bonds not paying anything means that all these bond sales, they don't have any competitors. They don't have government competitors. So the interest in all these corporate bonds are marginally larger than the next to nothing you get on a government bond. So that's got to change. ZIRP has got to come to an end, because as it generates more inflation, there's more and more momentum to take us out of the ZIRP policy. Now, when it ends, all of this currency that's trapped in these QE accounts, that can be seen as a default risk for the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve, being private, is balancing what it owes to the banks with the assets it's taken from the banks. And these assets, once the interest rate goes up, these assets, particularly the mortgage ones, were always dodgy. So when the interest rate goes up, and these mortgages, remember, are 25 to 30 years, so for many of them, the dodginess started at the very beginning. Some of them are probably dated 2005 and are set to expire 2035. So we can expect many of these MBSs to default, in which case the Federal Reserve hasn't anything to negotiate with the US Treasury. So the Federal Reserve can potentially go bankrupt, so it's a default risk. So anyone who's got currency, which is the big banks in the Federal Reserve, will want to turn that into bonds as quick as possible, especially when the interest rate rises. So if they're allowed to do that, then all of these electronic trillions that's in the Fed Reserve suddenly becomes a tradable currency, tradable government bonds. So they will flood America, and what you get is hyperinflation. Now the alternative to that is that the Federal Reserve is allowed to go bankrupt. If it goes bankrupt, then all of these quantitative easing accounts with all these banks, well, nothing is going to be paid. So these banks which need that for their liquidity are going to be illiquid, and then they go bankrupt. So what you get is a deflationary doomsday explosion, sucking all of the wealth from the banks and then from the greater part of American businesses. So you're left with America with almost no business, no production, lots of bad debts, and all these foreigners from overseas, they've got massive amounts of dollars. So what they would want to do is to buy when they can before the inflation sets in. So you'll see those dollars flood back into America, chasing a tiny amount of production. And the result of that is hyperinflation. So you've got a deflationary debt collapse. Deflation in this sense means bad debts in a chain reaction, resulting in hyperinflation. So the average man on the street will find that he's out of work. There's no welfare. If he does keep his job, his boss will tell him, will ask him whether he can come in for the next few months without pay, and then he'll go to the shops and find the prices are increasing 1,000% a week. That's the situation you've got for America, and of course it's given away most of its gold to China. So you have to wonder whether the leaders of America are, rather than bunkering down in Argentina, as some people say, whether they're more likely to go to a nuclear power such as China. You might find American elite transplant themselves to China, which is of course shielded with nuclear weapons, and they've shipped all the gold out there. So that's the doomsday scenario, and the outlook for Europe and the UK is similar. Perhaps with not the deflationary collapse. I think the banks will just print, so there'll still be hyperinflation. But it's not looking good. But that's my conclusion. Thank you very much, Mark Anthony Taylor, www.kingoftherepublic.com.